Welcome back to an episode of DEAP Podcast. I'm D.
I'm App.
And I'm Pod.
And all three of us are getting over some sort of cold, including the cat, if you hear him sneezing in the background. So we have 4 people who are sick, but we're going to try to keep our minds off of it by talking about everyone's favorite topic, which is food. And we've been kind of debating how in-depth and how specific we want to get on this topic. But in general, I think we're going to be talking about food cultivation and human intervention in food in general.
Mm-hmm. More broadly, I think people would call this GMOs, but there could be things that are not necessarily GMOs that we would be talking about.
Right. I think GMOs will kind of be the pinnacle example of human intervention in food, but there's a lot of human intervention in just food development and food processing. And so I think the generalized question that we should probably be asking ourselves is, to what degree should humans be interfering with the development of our own food? What is our responsibility to manage food production and food intake?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and kind of hard to answer in a lot of ways because we have to take into account the fact that we have to feed the world. There are so many people out there, and growing food and creating food on this kind of scale is pretty difficult.
Originally, when we were just subsistence farmers, you only have enough food for what you need immediately. When we were living in more temperate climates, you can have food year round and you can be hunter-gatherers without much issue. But now that we have a lot of people living up where it snows and you can't grow food year round, and we have a very large number of people, we need a larger amount of food to be able to supply the human population. So subsistence farming is no longer an option, so we need to be careful in our food management and food production. We can no longer just be hunter-gatherers.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that we need to define pretty early on here is how exactly are we defining GMO, genetically modified organisms? Because you could make the argument that any kind of selective breeding of plants, even back to our ancestors hundreds or thousands of years ago, could technically be a genetically modified organism. Or are we talking about actual gene therapies which have only been done for about 20 years?
So let's talk about selective breeding. Mm-hmm. Selective breeding sounds like it could be a scary process, but in terms of plants and cultivation, you're really saying, hey, this particular plant ended up producing a lot of fruit or a lot of food. I am going to take the pollen from that, crossbreed it with another similar plant that was also very productive, and grow it. Or even more simply than that, hey, this particular tree produced a lot of apples. Its genetics must be very good. I'm going to take the seeds from that tree and replant them, as opposed to a tree that only produced a couple of apples. Mm-hmm. It produces more apples. You take those seeds and plant those instead of the tree that grew very few. That's selective breeding. And when you do that for thousands of years, as we've been doing, as we've moved from subsistence farming to agricultural to industrial, we've been doing that selective breeding process, which is why, in general, with very few exceptions, unless you go out into a forest and pick some blueberries, it's nearly guaranteed that every piece of food you eat has been selectively bred.
Mm-hmm. Well, even ones that aren't selectively bred by humans are still selectively bred by evolution. Right?
Because they're producing more.
Yeah, going back to that apple example, the trees that are producing more apples are the ones that are going to pass on their genetics to the next generation, regardless of a human directly intervening.
So I don't think that that's selective breeding, though. That's survival of the fittest.
Yeah,
selective breeding is humans augmenting that process. That, hey, yeah, this tree would end up producing more, but we're not only going to do that, we're going to take the apples from the tree that produced fewer apples and explicitly not plant those at all.
Yeah,
right,
we're just saying it's very similar.
Right, but on the human side, we are speeding up that process. Mm-hmm. It may have occurred naturally over the course of thousands of years, but we may have been able to do it in hundreds instead.
Right. And I think that's an aspect that's going to come up multiple times in this discussion, is the idea of random chance process versus thought-assisted process, that humans being involved in the process is adding intention to the developmental process as opposed to random chance with, there's going to be a lot of apples. Some apples will do better than others. Now we're saying only the apples who have done well will end up getting the chance to reproduce. Now, some would argue, well, that's not natural, and natural is the best solution. Where does that, is there validity in that argument that only the natural solution is good?
So, I mean, that gets into the naturalness bias of, if something is natural, then it is good.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is that nature does not create things for humanity. Nature creates things for nature.
Right. A great example that I like to think about is, have you ever seen what a natural watermelon looked like? The rind was really thick. There were a whole bunch of seeds in the watermelon. That's not something that humans would want to eat, but it made sense in nature because that was going to survive better.
It was going to help the watermelon survive better as opposed to the human.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And an argument that I've heard people make is arsenic is a natural chemical. That does not make it good. You can find arsenic in some types of food, or in apple cores, cyanide. The stereotypical spy has a pill of cyanide in case he needs to kill himself. Cyanide will kill you in large amounts. It's a poison, but it's in apple cores. That does not mean that it's good for you just because it's naturally produced.
Mm-hmm.
So natural does not necessarily equate to being good. And I think that what originally brought up this question is whether or not naturally developed chemicals tend to be better than artificially developed chemicals. So, for instance, with the apples, if we start interfering with the growth of apples or watermelons, let's take that example. Watermelons used to have much more rind than they did the fleshy part of the fruit that we eat. By selectively breeding it, we're changing the dynamics of the fruit, and we're changing the chemical compositions, changing how many seeds are in it. Does interfering with that process and selectively breeding inherently make it worse?
I mean, I think it goes back to, it depends on what you mean by worse. If you're talking about for humanity, it's not worse. It's better for us to have watermelons that have parts of them that we can eat. If you're talking about the watermelon, a human cultivated watermelon is probably not going to survive as well without human intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as the watermelon is concerned, it might be better for it if we had left it alone.
And I think very related to that, there is a risk in having human cultivated, having only human cultivated foods. For instance, the banana. There is one strain of banana, and there are diseases that can decimate that particular strain.
And that's actually happened before, too.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of strains, and one of them has already been decimated.
Wiped out. So if we do selective breeding to the point where there is only one source of food or one species of food, and there's a disease that ends up hitting that, we can lose that source of food and go back to square one. Or worse than that, if it is the only strain that exists in that particular branch of food or that particular style, if it ends, we're screwed. Which is why people have been worried about bananas potentially going extinct because of the fact that we're in a all eggs in one basket or all bananas on one tree.
Mm-hmm.
I might have to start using that turn of phrase. So that is something that I think is bad in terms of selective breeding and putting our hands really, really deep into the manipulation of our food sources, that we can breed ourselves into a corner. That there is something to be said for genetic diversity.
Yeah, and there are other arguments that you could make against human intervention with regards to, think of it like the Jurassic Park example. They made dinosaurs because they could. They didn't really think through their processing very far, and unfortunately made some mistakes that ended up killing a bunch of people.
Sure, but that's also very much fantasy.
It is, but it's still the same concept of, like, when you are talking about gene manipulation, you don't always know what you're side effect is going to be.
Sure.
Right. And I actually read a really interesting article about this recently where some folks were trying to make cattle, specifically the bulls, not have horns because then they would be less dangerous.
Okay.
So they used a technique where they had a species of cattle that didn't have horns. They pulled out the genes for that and put them into our favorite Holstein cattle
Okay.
to try to remove the horns. It did remove the horns, but as a side effect of the process they used for this splicing, they actually also introduced a gene common in some bacteria that makes them resistant to antibiotics.
Well, that they are resistant to it,
Yeah, the
that
the
would
cattle.
be a good thing, right? That if they're resistant to antibiotics, that means that you can have more antibiotics to kill infections and have it be less effective on the cow.
But this gene is in the cow's DNA, and we don't necessarily know what other weird things are going to come around with that.
Or what that's going to do if we eat the cow, if that's going to affect our internal biology.
Right. And this was completely unintentional. They actually didn't even know that this happened until they were looking at these special cows' DNA to figure out if we could eat them. And then they found this gene in there. It's like, well, wait a minute. We can't actually eat them because we don't know what this gene would do.
Sure. And it sounds like that's a good example of an unintended consequence that when most people think of an unintended consequence, they'll think this is automatically bad. That it must be bad. And this is one of the arguments that I've heard against the idea of evolution in general, is that when you have a random mutation, well, it must be bad. It's like, no, that's not how it works. It's random chance. It could be good. It could be bad. In this case, we accidentally ended up getting antibacterial resistance. That sounds like it would be a good thing, but we don't know what the long-term ramifications are of it. So it has the possibility of being a good thing. It also has the possibility of being a bad thing. We haven't really determined that yet. This is also an argument, I think, for the idea of not having selective breeding. That when you do selective breeding or genetically modified organisms, you are entrusting to nature decision-making. That we have survived off of natural food for millions of years, at least according to the theory of evolution. Millions of years humans have survived, or humanoids have survived off of natural foods. I would say that that's a pretty good confidence level of natural food is good to an extent. If we start modifying that, we now have, this type of apple that's 5 years old. I don't have certainty that that's actually good or that it's good for me. I don't have reason to believe it's not, but it throws into question that those millions of years of experience that our ancestors have had.
All right, I can definitely see that. But in the case of crossing two different types of apples, I wouldn't be as concerned because both types of apples, especially if they've been around for a long time, okay, we know those are both generally good.
And they've also, naturally pollinated each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's a question for you, and dealing with the idea of splicing, or not splicing, but combining two things that otherwise wouldn't have been combined. Have you heard of a papal?
Yes.
No, this
So,
sounds interesting.
A papal is something that you can find them in grocery stores. They've been around for, 10 years, I think. It's a cross between a pear and an apple. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It has the taste of a pear and the taste of an apple, and it has a texture that is a mixture of an apple and a pear. It is a perfect half and half melding of a pear and an apple. And you can get these. So you were saying just now that having two different types of apples and mix them together, cool, we have a new type of apple. What if we mix slightly unlike things like a pear and an apple?
I think at that point, though, we still know that the pear and the apple are both things that we know that we can eat.
Mm-hmm. That despite the fact that they're from different species, we know that both pieces of the source are okay, therefore the product should also be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in the case of pears and apples, okay, they're both fruits. So they're even at least relatively similar to each other in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And they're also both plant material, which is going to be different than the cow example, because plants, generally speaking, are going to be a lot more simplistic in their makeup.
Mm-hmm. Particularly fruit, that you're producing basically carbohydrates or some form of sugar. It's being produced and stored in the fruit. There are some other vitamins that are also going to be in it, but that's really the main thing you care about with animals, and particularly eating animals. You're eating the muscle fibers, which are going to be much, much more complex than the simple sugars of most plants.
Well, as far as animals are concerned, you're also not just concerned about the animal, you are concerned about their gut bacteria and other health factors that are not necessarily just a particular piece.
It's an internal ecosystem that trees are part of a larger ecosystem, but their internal ecosystem is going to be more simplistic than an animal's internal ecosystem, where, at least in humans, you have more bacterial cells than you do your own human cells. There's a lot more going on in you than just your human cells, and if we modify the genetics of animals, it's much more likely to have a negative impact on that environment in general. So it sounds like the more complex the system that you're tinkering with, the more cautious we should be. That pears and apples are both really well understood. Yep, these are both pretty safe fruits. All right, hey, we found a way to combine them. I guess I'm not too worried about that because the sources are both good. It's like saying, oh, this is a human couple that they're going to be reproducing. Both of them are healthy. Well, we don't know exactly what type of child is going to come out. Sure, but we've seen human reproduction happen a lot. Apples have reproduced with each other a lot. Pears have reproduced with each other a lot. Breeding those two together would be similar to taking two different types of humans from opposite parts of the world and having them breed. And I know that that's been very contentious in the past, but I think it's fair to draw at least a similarity between those topics. I'm not saying that two different types of people are going to be as different as a pear and an apple, but it's a similar concept. That they can both breed amongst themselves, and if they can produce a child between the two of them, what's wrong with it?
Yeah, I think in this pear and apple example, it would be interesting to know how that pairing came about. Was this through just cross-pollination, or was this done more in a lab?
I'm not sure.
In terms of things done in labs, there's actually very few plants that have any kind of genetic tinkering done.
And this is something that I don't think most people realize, that I have a list of all genetically modified organisms that are currently used, at least in the United States.
Okay.
So I'm going to read off this list. You ready? Alfalfa, which I believe is mostly used for animal feed.
Yeah. Cows eat that.
So not too worried about that. Canola. So canola oil, and I think that's used in granola bars?
No,
just canola oil.
Used for a lot of cooking.
Okay. Cotton. We don't really eat that, generally speaking, so that's for clothes. Not too worried about that. Maize, which is corn. Papaya.
Interesting choice.
Yup. Potato. Soybean. Squash. And sugar beet. And sugar beet is because most of where we get our sugar from is from sugar beets, at least in the United States. It's a significant percentage. I think a majority comes from sugar beets as opposed to sugar cane. So really, in terms of things that people eat on a regular basis in the United States, we have corn, soy, and sugar. Those are really the only things that are genetically modified. Now, granted, you'll find corn extracts, so like cornstarch or corn syrup is going to be in a lot of heavily processed foods.
Soybeans as well.
So your soy latte, it's, I think 93% of all soy is genetically modified. And same thing, something like 92 or 94% of all corn that's grown is genetically modified. So under 9 out of 10 samples, that soy latte that you're drinking is probably genetically modified. Anything with some sort of corn syrup or cornstarch has genetically modified food in it. But there aren't many types of food.
Yeah, and like when we're thinking about things that on that list that we would eat, usually we think of it in terms of this thing is in processed foods that we're eating. We're not going out and eating a whole lot of corn by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right, or soybeans are another excellent example of that. You're not really going to buy those in the store.
Yeah,
sure.
You'll have edamame sometimes, occasionally, but usually that's going to be processed soy.
And I think we should definitely be talking about processed food versus raw food, but let's come back to that. Let's stick with the selective breeding and genetic modification for now. Are we okay with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. So papaya was listed on there. Why would we have to genetically modify a papaya?
I would think potentially be able to grow it in the United States. We don't necessarily have a lot of areas that could support that type of plant.
Yeah, I feel like if it's growing in the United States, we're probably growing it in Hawaii, which is going to be a micro ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And I was looking it up. One of the primary reasons that papaya was genetically modified is to give it an added resistance to a particular type of disease that's carried by insects that are in the same areas as papaya plants. So basically, papayas would frequently be decimated by this particular disease. So it was genetically modified to be resistant to that particular disease to make it less likely to die.
Mm-hmm. And that's usually when you're talking about GMOs, the reason why you're modifying it in the first place has nothing to do with the nutritional value of the food and has entirely to do with like pest control, disease resistance, herbicide resistance.
And in other words, you're not changing the type of sugar necessarily. That does sometimes come into it, of the type of sugar, but okay, there's a sugar that's being produced. We want this to be more beneficial. So let's make more of that sugar. We can activate this gene, which doubles the amount of sugar production. Cool. We now have the same food producing the same nutrients, but in a larger abundance.
All right, and that doesn't seem very worrisome to me.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other primary, as you mentioned, Pod, the other primary purpose is to increase its ability to resist particular types of diseases or pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the pesticides ones get interesting, particularly if you're thinking more along the lines of Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of interesting stuff around that because one farmer may be growing this corn, but then how does that affect the neighboring farms who aren't necessarily using that same strain? Because they may not want that kind of gene in their crops, but there is some cross-pollination that will occur.
And if you're using one of those where the whole premise of that is you have a chemical that can kill pests, you design a crop that is immune to the effects of that chemical, and then you can grow it, spray the chemical as much as you want, and not have to worry about the plant ending up getting hurt by it. But if another neighboring farm doesn't use that, and that pesticide gets into their farmland or into the ecosystem or into the water stream, it can then damage those plants. So we have the idea of, and one of the complaints that people have against Monsanto in particular is the idea of a monopoly. That, there's only this one strain. And so there's an extra amount of control that you have on that. And it's like, well, if you don't use this, if you use this, you can harm other people that aren't using it. And I think that that's a negative to GMOs, is that it requires a particular source. The GMO food needs to be produced as a GMO and then sold.
Mm-hmm. And usually with the GMO foods, if I recall, they are specifically bred or chosen so that they're not going to reproduce as much as a conventionally grown food. So like the Monsanto Roundup Ready corn are not going to produce as many plants the next year, so we have to keep rebuying.
And I don't know how much of that is intentional. I think it may be intentional to prevent it from becoming a weed. That the problem with weeds is that they reproduce very well and very rapidly. So if we make a food that produces a lot and reproduces extraordinarily well so that it can get out into nature, it could end up taking over the ecosystem and not just our farm fields. So there is a danger in that. It's also possible that it's most of the resources that the plant is using in terms of growing is just hurrying up, growing as fast as possible, and storing all of that in resources that we're going to end up eating and not necessarily seeds. Watermelon is a good example of that. So seedless watermelons. They're not technically seedless. They've got the little white seeds, but it's less annoying than the hard black seeds. Those can't reproduce. You can't take a seedless watermelon, obviously, and have it reproduce which is why seedless watermelons are genetically modified. But
Well, they're not modified in the same way as the lab modification. They are crossbred.
to create
for
that
that.
strain, and it's kind of a grow it once, and now you have to
Mhm.
recreate that
Mhm.
strain. But I think that's a good example of they can't reproduce, but in that particular case, that was intentional because we wanted to get rid of the seeds to make them easier to eat.
Mm-hmm.
So in some cases, in a lot of cases, you have to go back to the source to get your seeds, and that's one of the arguments against Monsanto again is they have a stranglehold on the market in terms of, oh, you want to keep growing corn? I guess you'll have to buy seeds from us. Is that bad?
I think it can be, because then it goes back to the whole point that you made earlier about having only one strain. If something happens, well, you're kind of in trouble
Mm-hmm.
because you really only have one choice.
Mm-hmm.
And another problem, too, is with some of these strains, as they become more widespread, then those genes could make it out into the wild and make, say, the weeds not respond to Roundup anymore. So you kind of lose anything you had to gain.
So I'll add on to this, and I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. Your car runs on gasoline, a very particular type of gasoline, and you have to get that from oil companies. If you stop buying it, you stop being able to use your car. So it's a consumable resource that you need to go from to the source company in order to get. That's similar to growing the corn, that if you want to keep growing the corn, you have to go back to the source company in order to get more. Is that a fair comparison, or is there something else that I'm missing?
I've at least got choices as to who I buy my oil from.
Okay.
There aren't necessarily many, but there are more choices there than with buying, like, corn. If I'm going to buy seed for corn, I don't really have a whole lot of options.
Mm-hmm. So the problem isn't necessarily needing to go through a consumable resource and go back to companies to get more. The problem is more the fact that it's a single strain, and if Monsanto is holding a patent for it, or for that variation or similarity to that strain, that's the bigger problem rather than having to go back to the company to get more of it. You would rather have multiple companies being able to do that particular type of genetic engineering.
That would be nice. So the issue with Monsanto is that at this point, GMOs have to be tested a lot
Mm-hmm.
to be able to get out into the open market, because we are concerned, rightfully so or unrightfully so, depending on your position, about the safety of those foods.
Because natural foods, we have thousands or millions of years of proof that, hey, we can eat these types of foods,
Mhm.
whereas, oh, well, we just genetically modified this 20 years ago.
Yeah. So in order to have a GMO company, they need to have money behind them to prove that their stuff is safe.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that lends itself to creating a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
The only people that can afford to do all the testing on a GMO are going to be the people that have a ton of money from making prior GMOs.
And if you have a type of corn that grows twice as fast, produces twice as much nutrients on half the amount of water compared to any other anything else in the market, any other type of corn in the market, you are going to have a massive advantage against anyone else or any other form of corn. And so from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. To those who have, everything will be given.
Mhm.
You very quickly have a monopoly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It takes money to make money. You make one strain of something, it does well. You make another strain of something, it does well. You now own all of the GMOs.
Mm-hmm. So what would be a way around that? Because it sounds like a single company is bad because we have a single point of failure, and a single strain is bad. So the solution to that would be make sure that there is an enforced non-monopoly, that in other words, that other companies should also be able to at least produce the strain. So you can have a gene and go through the testing, but should other companies be able to produce that, considering they didn't have to pay for all the testing and validation?
It's almost like a generic drug in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
where the company that creates it initially gets to hold it for a certain period of time, and then after that, it goes out to the rest of the market and they could make their own variations of it.
Mhm.
I could see something like that helping in this scenario. I know
So
it's not perfect, but
Yeah,
it could
and
help.
GMOs are so new that they haven't really gotten to that point of having a generic option.
So, an idea that I just thought of, and this applies to GMOs, where you need to test the validity of the food, as well as drugs in general, pharmaceutical drugs. If the problem is that you need to have a lot of research or a lot of money go into the research of a particular type of drug and into the validation that it doesn't have negative side effects and it does the thing that it claims to do, should it be permitted for other companies to produce that as long as there is a royalty paid to the company that did the initial research and validation up to make up the cost of the risk involved?
I mean, that still doesn't get around the single strain problem. If you have multiple companies all making the same single strain, and the thing with GMOs is that usually it's one or a small handful of genes that are the novel piece of the puzzle here.
right. So I see the royalties working, at least to get more people in the market, but even then, it still does not solve the problem of having one strain being used everywhere. Because if we get a disease that is very targeted to that strain, we're out of food.
Mm-hmm.
So should there be a limit on what percentage of a crop can be GMO or a particular strain of GMO?
I mean, I think that gets into how much power do we want to give local governments or federal governments at that point. If you say, okay, you can only grow this much of this particular crop, then you're telling the farmers that don't get in on that, hey, you don't get to make money. Your neighbor gets to grow this corn that grows twice as fast, but you didn't sign up fast enough. You didn't win the lotto to be able to grow it, so sucks to be you.
Right, and a lot of times, well, some types of food can be damaging on soil, which is why you end up doing a crop rotation. But that could actually play into, I guess, increasing government regulation on the way that farmers grow food, then in order to make sure that we have diversity in the food, as well as being able to take advantage of the benefits of GMOs, have a crop rotation that if you are going to grow this particular type of food, you can grow GMOs, but it would be a year of GMO, year of non, and or of different types of GMOs, so that we have kind of an enforced crop rotation, which is something that farmers tend to do anyway. But having that top-down approach can have major disadvantages, particularly when you have a large country and lots of different types of farmland that the farmers end up knowing best.
Right.
Mhm.
I couldn't imagine the government stepping in and knowing very well, what strains in particular would grow on a random farmer's plot easily.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that the top-down approach is probably not the best way to go, but then how do we avoid having the single strain problem?
So one thing that would be nice, I don't know how many other countries are in the GMO market right now, but this goes kind of similar for GMOs as well as pharmaceuticals, is if the FDA would streamline processes based on other countries' research. So it's a problem in the pharmaceutical company area, at least, because say the UK invents a new drug. It works really well. The UK says, yes, this is a good drug. They want to release it in the US market, and the FDA says you have to go through the entire process again as if this is a brand new drug. Even if we have, 1 million patients in the UK taking it, doesn't matter. Got to do it again.
And I think that creates a big barrier for entry,
Mm-hmm.
which it further increases the problem of a single strain and a single point of failure.
Yeah. So doing something like that or streamlining things so that if, say, Poland makes a new type of potato.
Or Ireland.
Or Ireland makes a new type of potato, I don't know. And if the FDA decides, like, okay, we trust their research, we're going to streamline your process, make it, 50% faster to go through.
The government
make it
can
cheaper.
The government can assist in streamlining subsequent research that would be competitors to the dominant strain. That, hey, there's a dominant strain. This is a single point in failure. We don't want a single point in failure. That is something that will benefit everyone. Therefore, if you come up with something that shows reasonable promise to be a competitor to that, that should be not necessarily given an advantage, but given a fair fighting chance to establish itself in the market as an equal competitor.
Yeah. And like, in terms of us being concerned about, oh, that means we're giving international or giving other countries extra advantages in the U.S. market. Let's be real. A lot of these are going to be international companies that if they know about this loophole, quote unquote loophole, they may just start in this other country first and then bring it to the U.S.
Well,
and even if they're a U.S. company.
Even if it's not just from a particular country to a particular country, a lot of the food that the U.S. eats or the U.S. consumes comes from other countries depending on the time of the year. You can't grow raspberries in the United States, I believe, during the winter. Like even in the South, it can be very difficult, which is why a lot of types of food are going to be imported from other countries, from the Southern Hemisphere.
Exactly.
So it would benefit us to help streamline that process for those countries because we're going to be one of the primary purchasers of that food.
Right. One thing we'd have to keep in mind, though, is what those processes in those other countries look like. Because in some cases, they may be significantly less stringent than we have in the U.S.
Yeah. I mean, I was not saying, oh, if any country out there says it's good, then it's good. But that we take into consideration, what is your testing protocol? Okay, we're going to waive these 3 parts of the process because they match what we would have done anyway. So rather than us repeating the same research.
It's not saying it's basically giving a way of other countries to say, here's our research. It's like, okay, yep, this research is equivalent to this validation process that we already have. Therefore, we will also accept it. So it's having a kind of like in colleges, you can transfer between colleges and go through different technical classes, but the credits will carry over. Kind of that sort of accreditation process. And I think that's a way of encouraging companies from across the world to also develop other strains. And I think it's not just other countries developing it, it's other companies developing a different strain that does a different thing. Those subsequent strains should be more streamlined than the first strain because having all your bananas in one tree poses a certain risk. And so there is benefit to having multiple, just like there are many species of apples throughout the world. So there's safety in that diversity. And I think that's something that we should aim to maintain with GMOs and be very careful with the hole that we're digging ourselves with GMOs, because while they can be very advantageous, again, I mentioned it earlier, most people don't realize that GMOs can grow off of less water or more frequent droughts, so they can be drought resistant and produce higher yields and have significantly more nutritional value than natural foods. All natural food and non-genetically modified food can end up having less taste, be more bland, and not be as nutritionally beneficial as GMOs. That's why they're sold, is because they're more nutritionally valuable.
So one thing that reminded me of is there is this misconception that things that are organic, quote unquote, are the opposite of GMO. And that's not the case. Organic specifically refers to how the thing is grown, not necessarily the composition of the thing itself.
Yeah, if you're looking for a very fancy like tomato, the way it used to be, you'd be looking more for an heirloom variety, not just an organic label.
Yeah, because an organic seed would be like, okay, that tells me exactly nothing about this plant because they're all organic.
Well, and in the astronomical sense, whenever you hear astronomers saying, "Oh, we found organic compounds on this asteroid," it's like that just means that they found carbon. So there are different definitions of what organic means, but in terms of food, I think organic generally refers to does it use pesticides?
That's not actually what it refers to.
Okay, what does it?
So it refers to, does this thing use non-organic in that sense that you were talking about of like asteroids containing organic material? Does it use non-organic things in its growth?
So are the chemicals being used during its growth patterns non-carbonaceous?
Yep.
Does it contain carbon? So if you use chemicals that don't contain carbon, then it is not organic.
That's basically it. So like when you're talking about, you can use fertilizer in an organic garden, but it needs to be like chicken poop would be a fertilizer that would be acceptable.
As opposed to ammonium nitrate.
Yeah.
And that does have a detriment to it, that if you're using chicken poop or cow poop, if those animals end up having diseases associated with them, and that's what you're using to fertilize your plant, that disease can latch itself onto the plant as it grows and transfer itself potentially to humans if they are susceptible to that particular type of disease.
Right. If the manure isn't properly processed beforehand, you can get things like E. coli or salmonella very easily.
Mm-hmm. And that can be a huge problem in certain types of foods, especially, I know there's been a lot of outbreaks of romaine lettuce having E. coli. That is a major contributing factor. We can't really wash lettuce very well, and you don't cook it. So if there's something on that field that's just a little off, hundreds of people can get sick.
Which is why potentially using fertilizers that do not carry the inherent risk of contamination of disease can be beneficial. Last time I checked, ammonium nitrate can't get sick, but chickens can.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a detriment to using natural fertilizers.
Mm-hmm. They're also not necessarily as efficient, which is where you get into the food security piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
That organically grown things are not going to produce as many, fruits or vegetables or grow as deep of roots.
From the same input resources, because chicken poop per volume contains less of the nutrients that plants need compared with ammonium nitrate. That ammonium nitrate is like, look, they need nitrates. Plants need nitrates, so let's just get them the highest density thing that we can, highest density chemical that we can, and use that to give to the plants so that they can produce more, grow more quickly, and be more efficient. It's just not the same with chicken poop.
Right. It's like I bought some pomegranates the other day, and it was interesting to compare the organic ones versus the non-organic ones. The non-organic ones were pretty big, slightly larger than a softball, and then the organic ones were maybe half the size.
Mm-hmm.
Because they end up getting less nutrients.
Yep.
Or fewer nutrients. Less and fewer, actually, in this case.
Yeah. And it comes back to the naturalness bias of, if it says it's organic, if it says it's natural, then it must be better. But since when did evolution know what humanity needs better than, humanity does?
or scientific research. And to your point on naturalness bias of, if it says organic, that must be good, and if it says GMO, it must be bad. Just because it says something on a label does not mean that it even applies to that particular type of food. As an example, I have seen pickle jars that say non-GMO. It's like, well, obviously, there is no such thing as a GMO cucumber. Therefore, it's obviously not GMO.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never see a GMO pickle, at least not right now, because we haven't done anything with that, because that's not really a staple food.
Mm-hmm. I've seen non-GMO salt before, and it's like, salt's not even technically organic, so I don't know where you guys are going with this.
Oh, no, but it could be organic if the process that was used didn't involve any special chemicals. So technically speaking, and the way that salt, in Roman times, the way that salt was produced is they would take salt water, create some sort of artificial pond or artificial lake, and then just let it dry up so that there's no inlet. And eventually they would be left with a large salt bed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an organic process. You're not really using anything artificial, so that's organic salt, but that also means that all salt is going to be organic, which goes against the astronomical definition because there's no carbon in it. But salt is a chemical. It is used in food, but it is a chemical. Sodium chloride. That's all it is. Sometimes there are going to be additives, like if there's iodine additives, but iodine is not GMO. That's an element on the periodic table that's added. So you have sodium chloride with iodine.
Mm-hmm.
That has nothing to do at all with GMOs. So seeing non-GMO salt, like you mentioned, is just stupid. And I changed that. It's a marketing tactic.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely a marketing tactic.
And that's what a lot of this is that a pomegranate that, like you mentioned, that's organic is going to be smaller. It's going to be not going to have as much nutritional value because the fruit is going to be less sizable. A larger likelihood of it being diseased or susceptible to disease because you're going to be using poop instead of ammonium nitrate. And in the case of GMOs, not in the case of pomegranates, but GMOs in general, a lot of times what's put into them is a gene that gives them added resistance to particular types of diseases. So organic is not going to have that in general, that disease protection, so you are more at risk. But if people want the natural, okay, we'll sell you natural. We'll sell you organic non-GMO salt, and if that makes you pay more for the same exact type of salt that you would otherwise, you're being taken advantage of.
And that actually brings up an interesting point, too, of the organic label is actually a thing that the FDA looks at. There are standards for labeling something organic, but as far as I'm aware, there aren't actually standards for labeling something as natural.
Because, like we mentioned before, almost nothing that you have, nothing that you can find is truly natural, just because selective breeding has been a thing for thousands of years. So really, no types of food that are out there are going to be completely natural, with few exceptions. I think maybe some fish could be.
Something like that, maybe.
Like if you're doing just open sea fishing, so tuna, potentially that would be natural, depending on how it's processed. So depending on how many preservatives or additives you have. So really, in some cases, what you're buying is not the study that has gone into a particular type of food. It's not the value of the food itself. It is your vote into what process you believe to be the best. That if you just have an inherent bias towards nature versus science, then, well, I'll trust nature more, and I'm going to vote with that. And whether or not it's marketing or not, I will go with what's natural over what's developed by man any day.
I mean, there is some truth to the fact that organically grown things may have more of certain types of nutrients than conventionally grown.
Saying GMO, you mean?
I'm talking just the organic versus conventionally.
Okay.
Just from the perspective of, like, the nutrient density may be higher.
Okay.
So, like, there is, it's not entirely like, oh, it's exactly the same, but the question becomes still, the nutrient density is going to be higher, but it's half the size of the other thing, so
and probably
overall
costs
it's about
more.
the same.
And cost is a big portion of it, is that generally speaking, organic food is more expensive for smaller amounts. The reason why is because when you use just organic materials, like we were saying, chicken poop versus ammonium nitrate, the plants aren't able to grow as quickly. Well, most of the time, organic food needs more water to grow and can't be as densely packed.
Well, you have more of a weed problem. You have
because you can't use the artificial pesticides.
which means you have to work harder for the same amount of acreage, which means that you can't grow as many acres of organic as you can conventionally grown. Which means you're talking smaller farmers. They don't have the ability to mass produce in the same way that a conventional farmer would.
And even if they do, it takes more resources to produce it, which is why organic food is so much more expensive than normal food. And I use normal food because it's food that doesn't have a modifier on it. Organic does have the modifier on it. So it's in a way an argument against natural food or organic food, or organically prepared food, in the way that we've been describing it is more resource intensive to make organic food. And a lot of the people that I see pushing for organic food are those that are saying, oh, we need to protect the environment. It's like, sure, I agree. And if you want to protect the environment, you do what has the smallest impact on the environment, which is going to be, ironically, the opposite of organic preparation, because organic has a larger footprint in terms of water usage, land usage, and resource usage. It is better to do the GMO route whenever possible, or at least the selective breeding and using those artificial fertilizers to facilitate growth and to lessen your impact on the environment.
Right, and even within conventional farming, there are a lot of things you can do to lessen the impact as well. A great example is more responsible fertilizer use, so you don't get as much runoff.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Another benefit to using GMOs in general is if you can make a plant more resilient against insects. So if it can survive better, if it misses some of it, if it gets half eaten, but it can still continue to grow based on its genetics, that means that you don't have to use as many pesticides, which is a benefit, because the fewer pesticides you can use, the less you'll affect bees. And I think worldwide, there's been an increased problem with bee populations dying off, which prevents a lot of the natural pollination that occurs across all species of plants.
Mm-hmm.
So the fewer pesticides you can use, the better, and you can genetically engineer plants to be more resilient to bugs without the use of pesticides.
Going off on a little tangent here about bugs.
Mm-hmm.
So plants are not the only things that we have genetically modified. Mosquitoes are actually, there are a couple of different strains of genetically modified mosquitoes.
Now, why would you want to genetically modify mosquitoes?
Good question. So there's kind of two different strains of them. One of them makes it so that they are more resilient to malaria, which is arguably a good thing. You release certain mosquitoes into an area that are resistant to malaria.
And
they
I
pass on the gene.
And I believe malaria still kills millions of people a year.
It's pretty devastating in certain parts of the world, yes. Yeah. They breed with the other mosquitoes that are in that area. That now gets passed on. You now have a lower chance of malaria getting out into the population. The other kind...
And just, I want to jump in there, because we're not killing off the mosquitoes. In that case...
that example, we're not killing off the mosquitoes.
Right. The mosquitoes are still there, and we're not going out and capturing necessarily or trying to kill off a bunch of the mosquitoes that are out there. We're just breeding our own mosquitoes that still are able to reproduce, but have an inherent protection against something that kills millions of us, and they breed that resistance into the population. So we can kill off diseases by affecting a particular portion of the chain or the carrier of that disease, while still including that carrier in the environment. We're not eliminating the carrier.
Mm-hmm. The second kind actually does kill off the mosquitoes.
You're ruining my point.
I know, right? Where they genetically modify a bunch of male mosquitoes. They have a gene that, when passed on, kills their progeny before they reach sexual maturity. So they get released out into the environment. They mate with the female mosquitoes who have tons of baby mosquitoes. They die before they can reproduce. And in tests, they did a test in a neighborhood in Brazil. They reduced the mosquito population by about 95% by doing this.
That's insane. But I'd worry about all the other effects on the environment in that case.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that you're bringing up is the fact that they're releasing basically sterile mosquitoes out that can still mosquitoes that can reproduce, but that their progeny can't reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, not all of the matings that are going to take place with the natural mosquitoes are still going to be mating with each other, but also with the artificial ones.
Mm-hmm.
So there will still be a mosquito population afterwards. It'll just be drastically reduced.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way of controlling the population as opposed to eliminating the population.
Yeah, and it's also self-limiting in terms of the ones that you released out into the wild can't reproduce, so they can't pass it on one more generation. But the use case there would be more for things like the Olympics or other types of large events where you don't want the mosquitoes now, but you don't want to like kill them off completely.
That's fair. Because I could definitely see a lot of pros to that, especially in an area that has a lot of mosquito-borne diseases.
Yeah, like they just had a major malaria outbreak. It's running rampant. Let's go in, do this, sort of kill them off, and start again.
And I think an interesting idea would be combining those two. That if you create the create the artificial mosquitoes that end up not having viable offspring, that reduces the total mosquito population. That makes it easier for you to introduce the malaria immunity mosquitoes to breed with the natural ones, because in generation 1, you introduce the mosquitoes that their offspring will die. Let's say, for argument's sake, 99% of mosquitoes will end up dying off that way, and so you're left with 1% mosquitoes. Like all natural mosquitoes, there's only 1%. You now can introduce artificial mosquitoes that match that 1%, that have malarial immunity. Now you have 2% total mosquitoes. Those breed with each other. Now all of the mosquitoes from then on have malarial resistance. And then you just let the population reintroduce itself. Now you've just wiped out the ability for mosquitoes, or almost completely the ability for mosquitoes to carry malaria. Now, the 99%, I'm just pulling that number out of nothing. So that would be very risky, because if you miscalculate the numbers, then you'll just kill off the entire mosquito population. And I think, like you were saying, App, that's also very risky. And we saw problems with that in, I think it's called 4 Years of Hunger in China in the mid 20th century, where one of Mao's genius plans to help the population was kill all the birds. There are birds that eat farm seeds, and we need to have our farms be productive, so kill every bird you see. Well, they did. That caused the bug population to skyrocket, because these birds also ate bugs. The bug population skyrocketing caused crops to get decimated by insects and locusts eating the crops, and that led to years of starvation. That was a contributing factor to mass starvation. Is if you delete a species from an environment, it can have drastic, far-reaching effects on the humans that are trying to do it. So but with the genetic engineering, you can affect certain aspects of the species as opposed to the species as a whole. You're not just killing all of the species, you are affecting the way that they're able to reproduce in a more controlled way, as opposed to just random chance. And I think that really that's largely what we're getting to, is in the argument of GMO versus non-GMO. It's, what do you view as better? Trusting the random chance production that nature has said, yeah, this will technically not kill you under most circumstances, so this is the type of food that you can eat. Or, hey, so we did 20 years of research on this and found out that this is the chemical that is actually beneficial to us, and we found a way to make plants produce more of that, and we're going to do it artificially. So what are you trusting more? The evolutionary process or the scientific process? That's really your vote with GMO versus not.
Yeah, and GMOs are heavily studied. Like, plant for plant, they are significantly more studied than their natural variants.
That's where the money is.
Yeah. Well, like, it's also just a safety thing. The FDA is terrified that, we could recreate Jurassic Park.
Which I think that's... The recreating Jurassic Park is an extreme example, but that, because it's fantasy, it's kind of showing, all right, well, if everything goes really, really, really wrong, what could happen? And that was also crossbreeding very, very different species in that case, supposedly frogs and dinosaurs, which...
But that's a lot of what goes into these crossbreeds today for GMOs. So, like, an example of GMO that we do use actually a lot it's not really a plant. It's a GMO of a bacteria.
Okay.
Is I believe they use yeast and E. coli to produce human insulin. So they actually took human genes, put them in these bacteria, and that's where we get insulin today. This started back in the 70s. Before then, and even somewhat after that, we would use cow pancreases because that's where insulin is produced. There's a problem, though. Cows are susceptible to things like mad cow disease.
Mm-hmm.
Not a good mix for humans. So we do have insulin being produced with human genes in a non-human.
So that's another good example of GMOs being beneficial is that with your insulin example,
Mm-hmm.
when you're taking insulin from cows, you are susceptible to any disease that can be transferred from that cow to you. In the case of mad cow disease, that's a pretty bad risk. If we can avoid that risk by using bacteria to produce the same chemical, and insulin is just a chemical that we end up putting into our bodies, it doesn't matter if you've used bacteria for it or cows for it. The end result is going to be generally the same. If the end resulting chemical is the same and you can avoid disease in one of them,
Mm-hmm.
it's obvious that you should avoid the disease.
Yeah, but I was pointing out that you were saying, oh, well, Jurassic Park is such a fantasy because clearly we would never take dinosaurs and cross them with frogs. And I'm saying, but in reality, we do cross humans with bacteria, which are arguably further.
We're putting in a human gene into bacteria to produce a certain chemical. That's very different than creating a human bacteria hybrid, as in, that's a little bit of an extreme example. Let's say like the movie The Fly. I guess we're just doing using Jeff Goldblum movies as an example. The Fly, where he gets combined with between a human and a fly. That's a pretty weird combination, and we're not combining half the genetics of a human and half the genetics of a fly. You're saying a single gene from a human put into bacteria.
Yeah. But I mean, in Jurassic Park, they only pulled a little bit of frogs into the dinosaurs. It was a big mix.
Okay. And you're bringing up Jurassic Park a lot, and I think it's fair to bring up for the ideologic basis of it that, yes, when you modify, the more that you modify an organism, the less you know of what's going on, and the danger comes from not knowing what's going on. I don't think that we can point to Jurassic Park saying, this is the danger that's going to happen.
No,
we can point to Jurassic Park to say, the danger is that we don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in the case of the bacteria that we were talking about that can create insulin, we pinpointed exactly what we needed to do there. So that's not nearly as worrisome as something like Jurassic Park, where they didn't really know what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And this
bacteria are a lot more simplistic than, say, if we wanted to do genetic modifications on like a mammal or
that
something
is
a
very
little higher.
true.
And this is also something that is being used in just diseases. The fight against diseases in particular is, if we can take bacteria that, or if we can genetically modify some form of bacteria to only attack particular types of human cells, that's potentially a way of fighting cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what your white blood cells do. White blood cells are single-celled organisms that they selectively don't eat your own human cells, but can eat other cells. The reason that cancer is a problem is because the white blood cells can't discern between your cells and the cancerous cells. So if we modify either white blood cells or just some form of bacteria to be able to selectively destroy cancerous cells, because cancerous cells are genetically different to normal human cells, if they can chemically differentiate between those two, that's a potential way of solving cancer. or just other diseases in general, the way that diseases fight other diseases is by being able to find a genetic marker and attack that specific genetic marker. That like the level that at which bacteria operates is on the molecular level. And so if a certain molecule is only produced by a particular strain of bacteria, and you can create something that only attacks and latches onto that particular molecule, that's a form of genetic engineering that can have very targeted effects in fighting diseases, which I think arguably has a very positive effect, and it's going to be the primary way that we can fight diseases moving forward as general antibiotics become less viable and less effective.
Right, and I definitely agree with that. It makes a lot of sense, especially because we know what we're doing in those cases. I know that there's a lot of research still to be done, but if we know we can target this one specific molecule in there, that's a lot easier for us to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been coming up frequently of the idea of targeted action versus random action. All natural means random action, random processes, random selection, as opposed to genetic modification or selective breeding. It's targeted. Hey, we see a positive. We are going to select for that positive. That should be a good thing. And while it may have detrimental effects because you're changing the makeup, it's a targeted change, and it's targeted aiming specifically at positives, and we see the positive outcomes. You know, in selective breeding, hey, this plant was more productive. I'm going to produce more of that. We have reason to believe, granted a more short-term reason, but reason to believe that it will have a positive effect, so we're selecting for it. So I think that kind of wraps up the targeted genetic modification reasonably well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another point of confusion is the idea of artificial means completely different from natural.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also not always the case.
Yeah, so interesting kind of factoid is when you're talking about like flavorings, there's this perception when something says like, oh, this was artificially flavored or this was naturally flavored. There's a perception that, oh, you have to go with the naturally flavored because that means something. Chemically speaking, it generally doesn't. There may be some chemical differences. Usually artificial ones are going to be more simplistic. And oftentimes they are the same thing. Chemically speaking, a banana flavor that was made in a lab somewhere versus a banana flavor derived from a banana are the same thing.
It's the same inherent chemical that is making the flavor. But particularly if you have a banana extract versus just the banana flavor, maybe there's some extra nutrients that you aren't getting from the artificial flavor, but it's just because it's more reduced.
Except that when you're talking like if the food label just says natural flavors or just says artificial flavors, you're not getting any of the additional side benefits either.
Sure, that there may be other vitamins that are coming with the banana extract versus the artificial where it's just the banana flavor.
No, like when you say natural flavors, they've pulled out all of the other stuff with the banana. They have limited it down in a lab somewhere just to that same point as the artificial version.
So the artificial is starting from the ground up, building up that material. Natural flavors is just going to be the starting from the top and eliminating until you just have those flavors.
Yep. Down to the same chemicals or very similar chemicals with the same or potentially even arguably more processing.
That the number of steps that you need to take a natural material and reduce it down may be more intensive than just generating it with the artificial.
But again, coming back to the naturalness bias, people aren't going to want to buy candy that says, oh, this was made artificially. Because they're going to see,
a naturalness bias.
It's artificial. I don't want to give that to my kid. This other one is natural. That has to be better.
It sounds like part of the problem with natural versus artificial is not the materials themselves, but the muddied waters in terms of selling it.
Right, because natural does sound better. You know, if you told me, oh, look, you can buy this all-natural apple versus this artificial apple, I'm going to want to eat that all-natural apple instead.
I'm going to disagree with that. Natural absolutely does not necessarily mean better.
Oh, it doesn't mean it's better.
But from a marketing perspective,
it makes you feel better.
It makes you feel better, but it's like we have spent thousands of years trying to get ourselves out of nature. Building houses, building huts, making, just like digging into caves. It's like, man, I don't want to be out here with all these bugs and insects, and I'm going to go into this cave. Hey, I want to make my own cave. I'm going to make this pile of dirt. Hey, this pile of dirt started dissolving. I'm going to take it, mix it with some other chemicals, and burn it to create bricks. Or dry it out to create bricks, and then fire the bricks. Oh, that worked even better. And until the point where now we have brick buildings, concrete buildings, and skyscrapers that are made out of steel to remove ourselves as much as physically possible from the environment. Like, removal of nature is something that we have strived for, or being able to control our environment is something that we've been striving for thousands of years. And that's something that, while we've been saying that it's contradictory, that it's targeted choice versus natural choice, it's like we've been doing this and been making these decisions of removing ourselves from nature for thousands of years. Food, I think, is the most recent example of that, where we are modifying no longer the environment that we're in, but the components of the environment to more suit our needs. Which is why a lot of people will say it's like you're playing God. And so they may have an ideological disagreement with that, not in the sense of we shouldn't be modifying the environment. It's that we are modifying the environment to such a degree that we are playing with creation. And if you have a philosophical preponderance against that, I can understand that position. That you are philosophically against modifying the building blocks of life, not necessarily because of the risk, just because that it's ideologically opposed to what you believe. Because we are playing God in that way. But do we think that, I guess, in both of your opinions, is playing God, but trying to do so in an intellectual way and for the betterment of humanity, bad?
No, I think it's a way we're going to have to go, because at the rate the human population is growing, we're going to have to start changing things to better support ourselves. And I've got some own thoughts about human population growth, but if we're going to assume that, you know, the human population is going to keep growing, well, if we want humanity to thrive, we're going to have to modify our food to be able to grow more of it with more limited resources and things of that nature.
Yeah, and I think we do need to encourage or do the whole playing God thing with the caveats of, like, we do need to do it carefully.
Right, definitely agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you are playing God, if the creative steps that you can take are equivalent to creating new life, and we're going really philosophical here now, if you are modifying the building blocks of life and you can change life to your whim, and if we get to that point, you have a power that has up until now been only associated with God. That also means that if things go wrong, or if you intentionally misuse it, the ramifications of that are on the order of God smiting people.
Yeah. I was thinking more from the perspective of, like, the ability to kill a bunch of mosquitoes. Just because we could go in and just wipe out the mosquito population doesn't mean that we should. Because we do have to take into account the food chain. That what's eating the mosquitoes and what would happen if we got rid of all the mosquitoes to that thing.
And the more knowledge we accrue on that, just about that ecosystem and how to modify it, the more knowledge we accrue, the more capable we are in affecting that environment. But the more capable we are of affecting the environment, the more likely we are to also be able to destroy it. I think genetic modification is a good potential example of the power to create is equivalent to the power to destroy. Because if you know enough about something to be able to create it, you therefore know enough about it to know how to end it. And like the mosquito example, we can genetically modify mosquitoes to be infertile. That's an unimaginable power that 100 years ago people would not have been able to imagine. Do we have the right to wield that power?
I think sometimes we need to, but it needs to be very deliberate.
And I think it could be argued that we not only have the right, we have the obligation to. That very frequently you would hear, if you could solve one world problem, what would it be? Oh, I'd solve world hunger. It's like, people are working on that actively. The whole purpose of genetic modification is to be able to produce more food on fewer resources. We're playing God in that sense, but it's for benevolence. It's for the good of the human race. What's good for me, if I'm doing the development of that gene, what's good for me is going to be good for everyone else because I have more food. That means that other people are also going to have more food. Cool. I can benefit from the fact that other people have more food because I'm going to be making money on it. That's going to be one of the primary motivators, but it has the potential to have positive effects. It also has the potential to, if people want to, you could genetically modify something to just decimate a population.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and it'd be very easy to do that. Like the mosquito example, I keep going back to it because it's good, but you said that it took out about 95% of the population. Okay, well, you could just release more.
The better the good, the worse the bad.
Yeah.
And so to what degree are we okay with goodness? That genetic modification and genetic engineering can bring a lot of good into the world. Selectively breeding things can bring a lot of good in terms of food availability to worldwide populations. But as we gain that ability, we also gain the ability and knowledge to have the exact opposite effect. And there will be someone out there that really wants to do that. Granted, I think that I don't want to say what I think. Are people inherently good? Do people generally want to improve the world and improve the world for themselves and others, or actively make the world a worse place for others?
Philosophically, people are always seeking after the good for themselves.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They're not necessarily looking out for others as much as themselves.
And I think that assuming that that's true, that people inherently want what's best for themselves, making food that kills everyone is not good for you.
Correct. Because if I kill...
If my goal is to create a strain of food that eliminates all food, that's bad for me because I won't have food.
Well, it means you won't have food. All your friends are gonna die. Your family's gonna die.
If I don't have friends,
you're not gonna have a job
and
anymore.
if I hate all people, then maybe I'll just want to kill all, destroy all food sources. But that means that I'll also be destroying myself. Most people don't want to destroy themselves. So I think while people may not be acting benevolently towards others, they do act benevolently towards themselves. So the likelihood of wanting to create more food has self-benefits. And so it is more likely that people will want to act benevolently in terms of food chain-wide choices that are being made in the development of new foods. You would not want to stop the food chain. And while we would be gaining the ability to do so, as we learn more about how to genetically modify and genetically develop food, the likelihood of it being misused is going to be on those one-off cases where this person just wants to destroy humanity, and they'll find a way to do it.
Right. If they couldn't do it using GMOs, they're going to find some other way.
Right.
Yeah, and food's going to be kind of the weirdest way to try to kill humanity. Like, that's going to take a while, and you're going to have to make people eat it, and you're going to have production issues.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get it out there?
And you would have to argue to people, in order to get it out there, let's say that you have a strain that will produce one time and then die.
Mm-hmm.
You have to convince people, enough people, to only use that strain to decimate the population. Or I guess you could breed in so that the progeny would not be able to reproduce or have a decreasing probability of producing. But you would have to sneak that in and actually get it distributed out in order for it to take effect. Generally speaking, everyone wants what's best for themselves. So in order to have a worldwide effect of decimating a population or decimating a food source intentionally, you need to have the entire supply chain or most of the supply chain on board with decimating the food. And people along that chain are going to realize, no, I'm not going to decimate my own food chain.
Or, you somehow convince people that it's healthy and it gets out there, and, oh no, a bunch of people are dying. What has changed? Oh, this company just, started sending out this type of food.
And I
Maybe
think,
not eat it.
And I think
Yeah.
the important aspect is what's good for me just happens to be good for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably the critical point in this is the risk, while the risk is increasing of people using our coming up godlike abilities of food manipulation, yeah, people could misuse it. But that requires a large number of people to be on board with it. And in most cases, people want what's best for themselves, which happens to be what's best for others in the case of food production. I want more food. Well, I guess that means that other people are going to have more food as well. And while not everyone may want to be helping other people, most people are probably indifferent as opposed to wanting what's worst.
Mm-hmm. Or they get the warm, fuzzy feelings when they do good by somebody else. Where they're sort of seeking after they want for themselves the happy feeling of helping some other person not starve to death.
And I think I would like to think that there are more people that feel good from helping other people than feel good from hurting other people.
Mm-hmm.
I'd certainly hope so.
You may feel good at the expense of another person, but that's different from feeling good at the detriment of someone else. And that's something that I've seen from conspiracy theorists against Monsanto is Monsanto just wants a monopoly and to control world population, and so they're getting their foot in the market by creating these genetically modified organisms that only they can produce, and they're getting their foothold to have a control on the food population and be able to just control all of humanity. It's like that you're attributing a lot of motive just because it's a monopoly. Monopolies have bad aspects, and yeah, they want to control generally for the sake of money.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do anything bad.
It means that we are in some ways trusting that they won't do anything bad, which ideally we would trust that to competition, at least in a capitalist society. We trust that multiple organizations competing against each other means that the company that is doing less harm as a whole and helping more as a whole would be the more successful company. And I think but that's a monopoly problem, not a food production problem.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Man, this conversation took a really hard turn in terms of going from what is the tastiest food to how can we use food to control human populations. So should we leave it at that? That while I don't like relying on others acting on the benevolence towards others, but I do trust that people generally act benevolently towards themselves. So in terms of gaining godlike powers of manipulating how your food is produced and manipulating the life associated with it, that having targeted changes in our food chain is a good thing, and people will generally act benevolently towards themselves. And in the case of modifying the food chain to be beneficial towards yourself, that is necessary that those changes will also be benevolent towards all other people or most other people. So generally speaking, having targeted changes in our food chain where we're intentionally making changes and monitoring those changes to be as good as possible, generally speaking, is a good thing, even though it has risks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Anything else you guys want to add?
Nope, I think that covers it.
Well, thanks for listening. And next time you're out in the grocery store and you see natural or non-GMO or anything like that, think about what you're actually buying and whether you're buying the content of the food or the idea behind the food. Because I think in most cases, particularly in marketing, you're mostly just buying the idea.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.